Beyond the Gates episode March 24th Revelations. Grayson sends a dangerous message. Here's a preview of what you can expect in the Beyond the Gates episode airing Tuesday, March 24th. Key points to remember. Grayson delivers a dangerous message that could reveal his true identity. Anita makes a life-changing decision about her healthcare, which will affect the entire Dupree family. Nicole and Donnie receive bad news. What begins as a quiet compromise made in desperation is about to explode into a crisis that could shatter Garland Memorial from the inside and rip the Dupree family apart at the very moment they can least afford another fracture. Behind sterile hospital walls, where healing is supposed to happen, fear is being traded like currency, loyalty is becoming a weapon, and the sick are no longer the only ones fighting for survival. One man is sinking deeper into a criminal network he once convinced himself he could control. One undercover cop is standing too close to the fire, forced to choose between the truth and the mission that depends on silence. At the same time, in another wing of that same hospital, a woman who has held her family together with grace, force, and sheer will is confronting the possibility that the final decision of her life may be the one her loved ones can never forgive. As money, illness, guilt, and power begin to collide, every relationship around them starts to crack under the pressure. No one is simply reacting anymore. Everyone is calculating, hiding, fearing, and preparing for loss in their own way. And the most dangerous part of it all is that every choice now comes wrapped in love. But underneath that love lives panic, pride, resentment, and the terrifying instinct to seize control before everything disappears. Grayson had not stepped into darkness because he was greedy, reckless, or thrill-seeking. That was the lie people like to tell themselves when they judge men like him from a safe distance. The truth was smaller, sadder, and far more humiliating. He was tired of watching numbers defeat him. Tired of standing in pharmacies pretending to compare prices when he already knew he could not afford what his mother needed. Tired of the look on her face when she tried to make herself smaller around her own pain so that her son would not feel crushed by it. Tired of wearing the title of laboratory technician like it was something stable and honorable while the paycheck behind it mocked him every month. Garland Memorial gave him access, routine, and proximity to things that moved quietly through the hospital system, and at some point desperation had turned proximity into temptation. What began as a compromise he told himself would only last a short while became a pattern, then a secret, then a trap. By the time he understood that he was no longer skimming the edge of something dirty but standing fully inside it, he had already crossed too many lines to pretend innocence. The plasma ring did not survive because of monsters alone. It survived because of people like Grayson, people pressed to the wall by debt, illness, shame, and the unbearable need to keep someone they loved alive just a little longer. But even that truth no longer protected him, Jacob knew. That was the new reality poisoning every step Grayson took. Jacob's silence was not comforting, it was terrifying. Silence from a man working undercover was never kindness, it was strategy. Grayson understood enough to know that men like Jacob did not gather secrets unless they planned to use them. The question haunting him was not whether Jacob would act, but when and with what method. A threat would have been easier to manage, a bribe could be resisted or accepted. But sympathy was the most dangerous weapon of all, because it blurred the line between manipulation and mercy. Grayson could not tell whether Jacob saw him as a weak link worth protecting, a disposable asset, or a witness being slowly maneuvered into betraying everyone above him. That uncertainty became unbearable after their last conversation, because there had been something in Jacob's restraint that felt even more menacing than anger. Grayson had expected pressure, perhaps even disgust, but instead he found calm. Calm meant thought. Calm meant Jacob was still deciding how best to use what he knew. It also meant that Grayson had no idea whether their exchange had been private at all. Hospitals have ears, corridors carry whispers. Doors do not always close completely. Surveillance is never as absent as people hope. The possibility that a third person may have overheard even a fragment of their conversation lodged in Grayson's mind like a splinter. In an operation built on secrecy, it would not take much to turn suspicion toward him. A glance held too long, a missed call, a strange buzzing conversation, one message delivered too carefully. And suddenly the men he worked for would stop seeing him as useful and start seeing him as unstable. That is what made the message he carried so dangerous. On the surface, he was still just a messenger, a middleman, a frightened man passing along information because he lacked the courage to refuse. But there was already reason to suspect he was much more deeply embedded than anyone wanted to admit. People do not trust simple couriers with layered knowledge unless those couriers have proven loyalty. Grayson knew schedules, patterns, shifts, storage access, and the small bureaucratic blind spots where illegal activity could slip through without immediate detection. He also knew enough to understand that some of the names floating above him had institutional protection, which was why the shadow of Dr. Leah Whitmore hung so heavily over everything. As Garland's chief of staff, Leah represented authority, order, and discipline. Yet power at that level could mean almost anything. She could be the architect hiding criminality beneath polished professionalism. She could be someone selectively looking away to preserve the hospital's reputation. Or she could be another figure being deceived from within her own institution while dangerous people used her trust as camouflage. The uncertainty around Leah made every move riskier, because if she was involved, Grayson was not just trapped in a side operation. He was standing inside a structure far larger and more protected than he had imagined. And hovering above all of it was his mother, the silent force behind every compromise he had made. Whether she knew the truth or not had become the question he feared more than arrest. If she knew, then every act of care he had offered her had been stained by disgrace. If she did not know, then he was living inside the cruel hypocrisy of trying to save her with money that would break her heart if she ever learned where it came from. That contradiction was hollowing him out. He was no longer even certain that he was doing this only for her. At some point, desperation had fused with wounded pride. He could not bear being the son who failed. He could not endure being seen as helpless by a system that measured human worth in what one could pay, access, and protect. So he kept going, telling himself each new risk was temporary, each delivery the last, each line necessary. Men in that state rarely realize the truth until it is too late. Survival can become addiction, and secrecy can start to feel like identity. Jacob, for his part, was no less conflicted. He had entered this world to expose it, not to become emotionally entangled with the weak points inside it. Yet Grayson's desperation complicated everything. It is easier to dismantle a criminal network when the people inside it are cold, ruthless, and unmistakably guilty. It becomes far harder when one of the players is a son drowning under medical bills, ashamed of what he has become, and dangerous precisely because he is not hardened enough to withstand pressure. Jacob had to decide whether preserving his cover required him to remain silent while Grayson slipped deeper into criminal dependency, or whether pushing too hard too soon would blow the entire operation. Every path carried risk, protect the mission, and he might condemn Grayson to ruin. Push Grayson to cooperate, and panic might drive the man straight back to the organization, exposing Jacob and triggering retaliation. Offer compassion, and he could lose the clarity an undercover officer needs to survive. Threaten him, and he might create the very enemy he was trying to turn. That moral tension sharpened the atmosphere around them until every interaction felt like a duel disguised as conversation. Grayson feared Jacob's intentions, yet could not stop measuring him for signs of possible rescue. Jacob distrusted Grayson's judgment, yet could not dismiss the human anguish driving it. Both men were standing on opposite sides of the same collapsing bridge, each needing something from the other and each suspecting betrayal. That is why the message matters so much. Whether it was meant for Jacob, from the police, or connected to the plasma ring's higher command, the real danger lay in what it revealed about Grayson's position. A man who carries dangerous messages is not merely adjacent to the crime. He's already inside the bloodstream of it. Elsewhere in Garland Memorial, another fight was unfolding, one far more intimate and, in some ways, even more devastating. Anita, diminished physically but not spiritually, had reached the point where the brutality of treatment was beginning to eclipse the promise of recovery. The drug they called the Red Devil had not only ravaged her body but stripped away the illusion that endurance always equals hope. She had given so much of herself for so long that the idea of one final act of control began to take on the force of dignity. Her decision to sign a do not resuscitate order was not the surrender her family would inevitably fear. To her, it was clarity. It was refusal. It was the insistence that love should not become an excuse to turn her body into a battlefield long after she had decided what peace looked like. But even within that strength lived secrecy. Anita may have been exhausted, yes, but there were signs that exhaustion alone was not driving her. There was a stillness to her resolve that suggested she knew more than she had said, perhaps about the progression of her illness, perhaps about how little time remained, perhaps about the cost her decline would exact on Vernon and the daughters who still needed her as the emotional axis of the family. Anita understood something her family did not want to face. Illness changes the moral balance inside a household. Every decision becomes collective, even when the suffering is personal. She did not want to place that burden on those she loved. Yet in trying to spare them, she was also taking from them the one illusion grief always clings to, the illusion that more could have been done. That is why her choice was destined to tear through the family, because ADNR is never heard simply as a medical directive. It is heard as a verdict, a farewell, a line drawn where others are begging for one more chance. Anita's body was hers. Her suffering was hers, her threshold was hers, but love rarely respects boundaries when death begins to move closer. In the eyes of those around her, especially those already panicking, her decision would feel like abandonment even if it was rooted in mercy. Vernon stood at the center of that contradiction with the weary heartbreak of a man who had spent a lifetime beside a woman he admired precisely because she could never be controlled. His remark that he had never been able to stop Anita from doing what she wanted was true, but the truth concealed layers of anguish. There is a difference between respecting a strong woman's will and watching that same will guide her toward a decision that may leave you behind. Vernon's pain was not simply that Anita had decided. It was that he knew forcing her otherwise would betray everything their life together had stood for. To love Anita had always meant honoring her autonomy, her steel, her right to choose. But now that devotion demanded something unbearable, that he possibly let her go in the way she wanted, even if every instinct in him cried out to fight for more time. His composure, then, was not peace. It was helplessness dressed in dignity. He was not surrendering because he did not care. He was surrendering because love had cornered him into accepting a truth he could not change. Nicole and Donnie were bound to react differently, but both would be driven by fear more than they wished to admit. Nicole, more controlled on the surface, would likely frame resistance as reason, practicality, or hope. But beneath that would live a daughter's refusal to accept that her mother had seen the end more clearly than the rest of them. Nicole would not merely be fighting for Anita's life. She would be fighting against the terror of becoming a woman who has to exist in a world no longer anchored by her mother's presence. Donnie's reaction would burn more opally. Her fury would look like defiance, outrage, maybe even accusation, but underneath it would be grief in its rawest form. She would rage because rage is easier than collapse. Easier than admitting that no matter how much love fills a room, it cannot always stop the body from breaking. Both daughters might insist they were acting for Anita, but in truth they would also be acting for themselves, for the frightened children hidden beneath their adulthood. The daughters who are suddenly being forced to imagine the future without the woman who shaped them. That same fracture would ripple down to Cod, whose response carries a different kind of vulnerability. Because she had lived with her grandparents and seen Anita's decline up close, this was not an abstract family tragedy to her. It was daily erosion. It was the loss of a sanctuary she had come to depend on. Anita was not only a grandmother, she represented continuity, warmth, structure, and a kind of emotional safety that cannot be replaced once it is gone. Kat's panic, then, would not only come from fear of death. It would come from the terror of losing the last place where life still felt held together. Yet suffering can also sharpen awareness. Watching Anita endure such pain could force Kat into a painful reckoning about her own life, her own immaturity, the things she has taken for granted. There is every possibility that Kat knows more than she has revealed, not necessarily in a plot-driven sense, but emotionally. She may already understand that Anita's suffering has crossed into a realm where fighting for more treatment becomes selfish. That awareness would make her even more unstable, because it would isolate her inside a truth others around her are still refusing. Tomas stepping in to comfort Kat only deepens the tension. His presence can be read as tenderness, as genuine concern for a young woman unraveling under pressure. But in a family like the Duprees, especially during a crisis, motives are never accepted at face value. Is Tomas there because he truly cares for Kat, because her pain matters to him, because he cannot bear to watch her fall apart alone? Or is there some part of him that understands proximity during disaster creates intimacy, and intimacy creates access? Even if his feelings are sincere, suspicion will shadow them, because chaos invites opportunists as surely as it exposes the wounded. That ambiguity is what makes the moment dramatically rich. Kat, desperate for steadiness, may cling to Tomas because he is present when others are exploding. But dependence formed during crisis can become dangerous, especially if she is too emotionally exhausted to separate comfort from need. As Anita's medical choice sends shockwaves through the family, and as Grayson's secret life threatens to drag Garland Memorial into scandal, the two storylines begin to mirror each other in disturbing ways. Both are about bodies under siege. Both are about institutions that claim to preserve life while quietly becoming battlegrounds for power, money, and control. Both are about people making impossible decisions while others around them interpret those decisions through the lens of fear. Grayson tells himself he broke the rules to save his mother. Anita is trying to set a boundary so her family will not destroy itself trying to save her. Jacob is torn between duty and compassion. Vernon is torn between respect and helplessness. Nicole, Donnie, Kat, and perhaps even Tomas are all being pulled into emotional positions they may not recover from cleanly. And above them all hovers the possibility that the hospital itself is rotting from within. That the same place witnessing Anita's most intimate pain is also hiding a criminal economy built on human vulnerability. That is what makes this moment so explosive. No one is dealing with one crisis at a time. Grief is colliding with corruption. Family loyalty is colliding with institutional betrayal. Love is colliding with pride. And every character is being pushed toward a version of themselves they may not want to recognize. Grayson may discover that desperation has already turned him into something far more dangerous than a messenger. Jacob may find that keeping his cover demands a cruelty he is not prepared to live with. Vernon may be forced to choose between honoring Anita's will and allowing his daughters to hate him for it. Nicole and Donnie may discover that their fight to keep their mother alive says as much about their terror as it does about their devotion. Kat may realize that the pain of watching Anita suffer is changing her from the inside, forcing her to confront truths about mortality, dependence, and love that she had not wanted to face yet. And if Laya truly knows more than she has revealed, then the coming fallout may prove that the sickness inside Garland Memorial was never confined to the oncology ward. In the end, what makes all of this so painful is that no one here is motivated by something simple. The criminals are not entirely without anguish. The loved ones are not entirely selfless. The protectors are not entirely pure. Everyone is compromised by emotion, by history, by fear of loss, by the instinct to hold on too long or let go too soon. That is where the real danger lives now. Not only in the plasma ring, not only in Anita's medical decision, but in the fact that every person involved can justify what they are about to do. And once people begin to believe that desperation makes them righteous, the worst choices often arrive wearing the face of love.